Yeah. Today is World Anabaptist Fellowship Sunday, and this is a day when we get to recall our forebears in the faith. Now, I first came across the story of the 16th century radical reformers when I was in college. And this was the perfect time for me to encounter their story, because in many ways, what I saw in the reformers was similar to where I was at as a 20-year-old. So when I looked at the reformers, what I saw was a group of people who said, no, we are not going to conform to the ways of this world. And I saw a group of people who said, yes, we are going to be disciples of Jesus. We are going to disrupt for the sake of discipleship. And now this resonated with me as a college student because I also had a little bit of a fire burning in my belly. And so one year as my college was doing its annual spring duct tape wars, this was a weird tradition that Messiah College students had. They would take cardboard and duct tape, make themselves various pieces of armor, various kinds of weapons, and have at it. Well, I was at Messiah at this time. I was reading about the radical reformers, and I was like, those radical reformers refuse to take up arms. I should protest. And so I think we have a picture up here. This is 20-year-old Melly with a friend of mine and my dear sweet husband who married me anyway. We were just dating at this time. But we went out and we protested the duct tape wars because it was war, and the radical reformers of the 16th century would not take up weapons. So the story of these 16th century reformers has been one that has resonated deeply for quite some time. And in many ways, this story of disruption and discipleship is one that we find repeated in today's lectionary texts. As we read in the story from Matthew chapter 4, Jesus goes and he finds a number of people. He starts with Simon and Andrew, then comes upon James and John, and in both cases, disrupts what is going on. See, these men are happily engaged in the pursuit of their family business. Especially in the case of James and John, Matthew even tells us they are in the boat with their father. They are being good children. They are contributing to the family business. They are helping to increase the family's wealth and resources. And then comes Jesus. Their family is disrupted. And yet that is not the only disruption that we see in this story. We also see that as Peter and Andrew and James and John are leaving their fishing business, they are disrupting the economy of their time. Warren Carter is a biblical scholar who looks at how the realities of empire in the first century would have shaped the New Testament texts. And Carter, as he reads this text, notes that in leaving the fishing business, these early disciples are disrupting the economic structures of their time. Carter suggests that in this time, the Roman Empire would have given something like fishing licenses is probably the best way to think about this, that if you wanted to go and be a professional fisher person, you would apply for your license from the empire. They'd say, great, have a license, but you make sure that you are giving us X number of fish to pay for your license. In other words, in order to pursue your business, you were also feeding into the economy of the first century Roman Empire. And so, when Peter and Andrew and James and John stop fishing, it's small, but they put a dent in the economy of the empire that was trying to take over the world. They became disruptors. And in fact, we find the disruption even more broadly pronounced when we think about the disruption to the larger political world. Matthew tells us that Jesus came and proclaimed that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And towards the end of the passage again, Jesus goes out and he preaches the good news of the kingdom. Now, that phrase, the good news of the kingdom, in Greek, ta euangelion tes basileas, we hear, I think, often with our Christian ears on. We hear the good news of the kingdom and think, yes, this is the gospel being proclaimed. But I'd like to suggest that the earliest hearers of this text would not have heard this as a spiritual message, but would have heard this as a message of politics. See, the term euangelion is the term that gets used to talk about the good news that goes out about the empire. Good news, we conquered another set of barbarians. Good news, the Pax Romana is still in place. Good news, this is language of politics. And likewise, basileia, kingdom. This might have originally been heard not as kingdom of heaven, but kingdom as in the empire, the reign of Rome, Caesar's power over the known land. And so in the same way that words for us today, like Senate, House, court, call to mind a political vocabulary, so too might the phrase, the good news of the kingdom, called to mind not a spiritual reality, but a political one. And so as Jesus proclaims the good news of the kingdom, what Jesus is proclaiming is a disruption to Rome. This is a disruption to the way that things are currently going. The good news of the kingdom is disruptive. But we don't stop there. See, this is not disruption for the sake of disruption. What we find is that as the disciples are disrupting their families, disrupting economy, as Jesus is disrupting the political sphere, this is a disruption for the sake of discipleship. And in fact, I'm struck by how many times in just this short passage, Matthew uses the term follow. Jesus calls the disciples to come with him, to follow him. Peter and Andrew, follow. James and John, follow. There's a sense of discipleship. And so I found myself thinking about this idea of following. What does it mean that they follow? Is this simply a relocation from one geographical place to another? They leave the Sea of Galilee, go somewhere else? Yes, they do that, to be sure. But I also found myself thinking about this language of following in the sense of how we talk about following in social media contexts today. See, I could talk about, I follow this influencer, or I follow Pastor Audrey on Facebook and see all of her fun pictures. The flower bouquet was lovely. But we can talk about following people on social media. And what does that connote for us? Well, in many ways, it tends to connote a sense of, I like your vibe. I see your aesthetic, and I want to copy that. Your way of life is something that is appealing to me. In fact, I found myself using the term follow just this week. At my office, we are currently switching out our copiers and printers, think like the big, giant, honking printers. And so right now we have our old, big, giant, honking printer sitting in what's the middle of basically the kitchen and entryway of our office. And so somebody came in and I was giving them a tour and showing them this and said, follow me for more interior design tips. Somehow they did not feel inclined to take my tips on interior design. So strange. But we use this term of following to say, we like the way that you're doing things. We want our lives to emulate your life. And so as the disciples follow Jesus, this is not just, I walk from this place to this place. This is saying, I like your lifestyle, and I want to take that up for myself. I see you disrupting, and I too wish to be disruptive. Now, this is where I think Paul's words in his letter to the Corinthians come as a helpful kind of corrective. See, we could hear disruption and think, this is simply disruption for the sake of disruption. This is, in many ways, 20-year-old Melly who was out there protesting the duct tape wars. I mean, let's be honest, I just kind of wanted to make a scene. It was disruption for the fun of it. But what Paul tells us in his letter to the Corinthians is that disruption, simply for the sake of disruption, is not what discipleship is all about. And in fact, on this Anabaptist World Sunday, I think it's important to say we are not just going out guns a-blazing. That's not what the Anabaptist 16th century reformers were doing. Because what we find as Paul speaks to the Corinthians is that when that disruption begins to poison the community of disciples, that disruption has gone too far. And that's what we find in Corinth, according to Paul. There are different factions beginning to emerge within the Corinthian church where people seem to be choosing their favorite leaders. You have some that are like, well, I follow Paul. And others like, I follow Apollos. Others like, I follow Peter. And then some who I hear in my mind is kind of like, Studi, I follow Christ. And so we have this division among the Corinthian Christians who are picking and choosing their favorite person. And Paul says, no, you have missed the point. Has Christ been divided? Has Paul been crucified for you? No. It is not about disruption simply for the sake of disruption when we are a community of disciples. Paul says to them, I pray that there would be no divisions among you, but that you would have the same view and the same perception. The same view and the same perception. And what is that view? What is the same mind that Paul hopes that the Corinthians will have? Well, I think that we can hear this as the mind of Christ. Paul says to them, I want you to have the same mind. I want you to share in the same mind of Christ, and in that way, not to be divided among yourselves. And so, yes, you have chosen this path of discipleship. You have chosen a path that disrupts the ways of the world, but that should not disrupt your community of disciples. And so I wonder how we hear these texts today. What are the implications for us today on this World Anabaptist Fellowship Sunday as we think about our own opportunities to be disruptors and to be disciples? Where do we pursue disruption? How do we disrupt systems of oppression and injustice? How do we disrupt patterns of thinking and speech that promote a Christian nationalism? How do we disrupt those places where there is injustice? And in many ways, this pairs with the question of where do we pursue discipleship? Well, perhaps as we pursue discipleship, this is a place where we ask where we ourselves have been perpetrators of injustice and oppression. Where do we need to be better discipled to recognize our complicity in the historical mistreatment and ongoing mistreatment of Indigenous communities? Where do we need to be discipled to be able to recognize the ways in which we have not cared for the land and the natural resources that God entrusted to humans? As I've thought about these questions, how to be both a disruptor and a disciple, in my head this past week, I've been hearing again and again echoes of the poem that Courtney read for us at the end of our service last week. And I know this also went out in the Wednesday email this past week, and I'd encourage you to reread it. But this reminded me of how we can be disruptors, how we can be disciples. And it reminded me as well of another poem with which I want to end. This is a poem that I've had a little trouble getting the exact provenance. Some people will attribute it to Sir Francis Drake, but that seems to be a bit of a problematic association. So I'm not 100% sure where this came from. There's some questions there. But I believe that the words of the poem will help us to consider the ways that we ourselves might be disruptors and be disciples. Disturb us, Lord. When we are too pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we dreamed too little, when we arrived safely because we sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of a new heaven to grow dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wilder seas, where, losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push back the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. Amen.